Crash is trash. 2025 edition. Now, we all know that Crash Bandicoot completely fell off in the 90s and has faded into irrelevancy since then, brought back for a brief period of time due to the remakes that were produced, but nobody has really gone into the nitty gritty as to what actually happened with this situation. Why did Crash fell off? Why is this brand such a huge, monumental failure? Well, to understand that, we have to backtrack to the 90s and we have to go back to why Crash was popular to begin with. And it is entirely because the character was sold to people who hate Nintendo. That's right. The only thing that anybody remembers about Crash Bandicoot is that commercial where he goes in front of the Nintendo of America building and starts screaming into a microphone like he's some protester or something. Don't support Nintendo. They're evil. Support Sony instead. It is a complete joke. It is honestly probably worse than what Sega did. What makes Crash different than Sonic, though, is that Sonic actually had a premise. It had a concept. It had a character that people actually genuinely liked with like characteristics that kids could understand the appeal of. Like, oh, it's an animal mascot, but he goes fast. Like it's simple, but it's effective. It has purpose to it. There's nuance to it. There is something there. Crash Bandicoot does not and never has had anywhere near the same level of credibility. Forget Crash being bigger than Mario, which is what the developers still maintain to this day. Crash was never even bigger than Sonic, which is kind of insane when you think about the fact that the Sony PlayStation supposedly outperformed Sega and Nintendo that generation. So what happened exactly? If Crash Bandicoot was the PlayStation mascot and the PlayStation was the market leader for that generation, clearly that would mean that Crash Bandicoot would become a video game icon, right? Well, the truth of the matter is PlayStation never won that generation. It was vastly outperformed by Nintendo because of the success of the Game Boy and Pokemon. Pikachu is recognizable. Crash Bandicoot is not. Nobody outside of people who bought bargain bin copies of Crash Bandicoot know anything or know anything about the character or have ever played the games. And the vast majority of these people have never actually played the games for any significant length of time, outside of maybe going through the first couple of levels and giving up because it was too hard. Crash Bandicoot clearly has no credibility among actual gamers, people who play more than 2 games a year. It is a brand that people recognize because they grew up playing demo stations and owned PlayStations growing up. Crash Bandicoot never really had any credibility to him. But when this audience grew up, Activision decided that, let's remake the original trilogy. Let's sell it to these people again. And for some reason, people just ate it up. For that brief period of time, people called Crash Bandicoot the Dark Souls of platformers, even though there are far more difficult platformers that exist on Nintendo platforms. Crash Bandicoot, the N. Sane Trilogy, was worshipped. Not because it was a particularly well-made remake or because it really added anything new or because the games were just such iconic classics. Like, the game blew up because people vaguely remembered Crash Bandicoot growing up and came back to buy all of the original games. It had nothing to do with the game's quality. It was sheer nostalgia of a property that was really never very good to begin with. It was no different in that regard than Michael Bay's Transformers movies or, these MCU products. People don't actually know anything about Marvel or like the history of the brand, but because of the success of the far superior Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, the MCU just kind of blew up and people started becoming invested in like these mediocre characters that no one's ever heard of before, like Black Panther and Doctor Strange and so forth. Like the MCU is the film equivalent of Crash Bandicoot, a mediocre product stapled together based off of nostalgia. Memories of days where you were not as sophisticated and understood that this kind of thing is garbage. So after the success of the Insane trilogy, Activision and Crash Bandicoot fanboys really thought that Crash was about to make a comeback. They thought Crash had it in him to be as big as Sonic, as big as Mario, bigger even, because of course this series was bigger than Mario in the 90s. So say the developers. This was supposed to be the series' big comeback point, its redemption arc. Crash was no longer trash. He would be bashing. He would be lashing out against all the doubters and people who made fun of him over the years. Crash Bandicoot was supposed to just usher in this new era of anti-Nintendo 3D platformers. Like PlayStation was supposed to have this crazy redemption arc because of Crash Bandicoot. It was supposed to be this big deal. They produced a sequel, Crash 4. They produced like a remake of the racing game. They produced Crash Rumble. They produced all these products, and without fail, each and every one of them completely bombed to the point where Activision completely lost interest and no further Crash games are in development. So what happened? What exactly happened here? Well, a lot of people will try and blame Crash Team Rumble specifically, but the reality is nobody ever actually finished the Insane trilogy. Crash 4 failed because nobody actually finished all 3 games in the Insane Trilogy collection, right? They were too hard for most people, and just like, back in the day, the game slowly lost relevancy as they came out because people started realizing that Crash Bandicoot was a lousy character with no real powers and nothing really fun about him. Like, Crash was just an inferior copy of Donkey Kong Country. Like, there's just no getting around it. Donkey Kong Country is a far superior platforming series than Crash Bandicoot ever was, and anybody who's actually played it would have been able to tell you that in a heartbeat. But because Crash Bandicoot was the PlayStation mascot, owners did not want to admit it to themselves that they were getting mogged by a Super Nintendo trilogy. So nobody actually finished the Insane trilogy. Nobody had any interest in Crash 4. And when Crash Team Rumble was announced, that just was such a controversial thing that was so antithetical to like what the audience wanted to see that the entire thing just collapsed, and there was just no real future for the franchise. And Activision pulled the plug. They understood that the Insane trilogy was a one-time thing rooted in nostalgia, and they understood that there simply is no future in the Crash Bandicoot brand. And this is all perfectly normal and perfectly rational considering the data, but delusionally, you still see a number of hardcore Crash Bandicoot fans who will try and tell you that Crash is secretly super successful, that Crash Bandicoot 4 actually sold like 5 million units, and that Crash Team Racing was actually way better than Mario Kart, and that Crash like could have been successful if Activision had simply given it a chance. And to that, I just shake my head and just laugh because what more could they have done with this IP? They gave Crash Bandicoot more than enough chances. They produced a direct sequel. They produced remakes of another beloved classic, and they produced a completely new IP, like a new game based on the characters. The reality of the situation is Crash Bandicoot is not flexible enough to have the same kind of well-rounded, engaging cast that Mario does. People like look at the Mario enemies and people like Pauline, Waluigi, Daisy, and like they're cult favorite characters in their own right. Like, who do you know who what Crash Bandicoot character does anyone know or care about? Like none. Like maybe people know Crash, maybe people know Coco or like, Dr. Vortex, but outside of that, who even are the side characters in Crash Bandicoot? None of them have really like established themselves. None of them have any presence. None of them are like fun or entertaining. They all come off like discount Cartoon Network villains. They all come off like they should have been on Mucha Lucha or something nonsensical like that. They all come off like just the absolute laziest Western design ever. Like, oh yeah, we'll just make an anthropomorphic animal and give it a goofy voice, and that's it. Like, they have no personality, they have no charm, they have no presence, they have no ability to like captivate an audience. Like, no one knows who they are, and they were supposed to carry Crash Team Rumble. You know what I mean? Like, this is the reality of the Crash Bandicoot brand, is that it was a brand that established itself because of the anti-Nintendo sentiments of the 90s that people became nostalgic for years down the line. And over time, people have begun to understand, to accept that Crash was never good, that it was always trash, and that their nostalgia for it was misplaced. And there's simply no future for this brand going forward. But a lot of people cannot bring themselves to admit it. A lot of people are diehard Crash fans and will do whatever it takes to gaslight people into thinking Crash is relevant and that he's on the same level as Mario and Sonic. And the reality is that simply is not true.